February 13, 1945. Bad Orb, Germany. Private Morton Goldstein shivered in the frozen mud as German officers moved through the ranks of American POWs, clipboards in hand. They were calling out names, always Jewish-sounding names. Goldstein, Shapiro, Levitt, Cohen. One by one, the soldiers were pulled from the line and marched to a separate barracks. Goldstein had survived the Battle of the Bulge. He'd survived the forced march to this godforsaken camp. But as the guard's hand fell on his shoulder, he understood with terrible clarity that his war was about to get much, much worse. That same day, 4,200 miles away in Aliceville, Alabama, Oberleutnant Werner Kritzler sat down to a dinner of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. He was a prisoner of war, yes, captured after his U-boat had been sunk off the coast of North Carolina. But the compound around him looked more like a small German town than a prison. There were gardens, a swimming pool under construction, and a theatre group rehearsing a production of Goethe's Faust. After dinner, Kritzler planned to attend a lecture on American literature. Tomorrow he might play soccer or work on the miniature railway he was building with fellow officers. These two scenes, unfolding simultaneously in February 1945, reveal one of World War II's most disturbing ironies, one that both the American and German governments would spend decades trying to bury. The story begins not with cruelty, but with Geneva Convention idealism and American abundance. When the first German POWs arrived on American soil in 1943, the United States was determined to demonstrate its moral superiority over Nazi Germany. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was clear. Prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, fed the same rations as the captor nation's troops, paid for their labor, and protected from degrading treatment. America would follow these rules to the letter, and then some by 1945. The United States held approximately 371,000 German prisoners in 501 camps scattered across the country. These weren't the concentration camps of popular imagination. They were, by any objective measure, comfortable. POWs received 3 full meals daily, totaling 4,000 calories, more than the average American civilian's 3,000-calorie allotment under wartime rationing. They were paid 80 cents per day for labor, real money they could spend in camp canteens stocked with cigarettes, candy, and beer. They received medical care that exceeded what was available to many rural Americans. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, German officers organized a full university curriculum. At Camp Mexia in Texas, POWs built an elaborate miniature town complete with streetlights. At Fort Getty in Rhode Island, they sunbathed on the beach. American guards, many of whom had fathers or brothers fighting in Europe, watched in barely contained fury as enemy soldiers lived better than their own families back home. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Gereke, a Lutheran chaplain who ministered to POWs at several camps, wrote in his diary on March 8, 1944, "These men eat better than my congregation in St. Louis. They have warm beds, medical care, entertainment. Meanwhile, my nephew writes from a foxhole in Italy that he hasn't had a hot meal in 3 weeks. How do I reconcile this?" The answer lay in American legal and moral philosophy. The United States was fighting to prove that democracy and rule of law were superior to fascist barbarism. Treating POWs well wasn't just about following rules. It was about demonstrating what made America worth defending. It was also practical. The better German POWs were treated, the theory went, the better American POWs would be treated in German camps. But this theory had a fatal flaw. It assumed reciprocity. It assumed the Nazis cared about American moral example. It assumed that international law meant something to a regime built on racial ideology and contempt for Jewish American democracy. The truth was being written in blood and frozen. Mud at a slave labor camp in central Germany. Berga an der Elster was not supposed to exist, at least not for American POWs. It was a satellite camp of Buchenwald, designed to house concentration camp inmates, primarily Jews, political prisoners, and others deemed subhuman by Nazi ideology. In early 1945, desperate to build underground factories to protect weapons production from Allied bombing, the Nazis needed labor. Lots of it. The inmates at Berga were dying too quickly to complete the tunnels being blasted into the hillside. Someone had an idea. Use American POWs. On February 8, 1945, German officers at Stalag 9B at Bad Orb received orders to select 350 American prisoners for special work detail. The selection process violated every principle of the Geneva Convention. Hauptmann Ludwig Merz, the camp adjutant, ordered his subordinates to identify Jewish soldiers by their names, facial features, and direct questioning. Non-commissioned officers were selected despite rules exempting them from labor. Men in poor health were chosen deliberately. They were considered expendable. Private Anthony Acevedo, a Mexican-American medic from California, kept a secret diary throughout his captivity. His entry from February 9, 1945 reads, "They're taking the Jewish boys. Also some who just look Jewish or have names that sound Jewish. Guys are lying saying they're Catholic, Protestant, anything. Doesn't matter. The Germans have their quota. 350 men. They say it's for a work camp with better conditions. Nobody believes it. Among the 350 were 80 Jewish American soldiers. The rest were non-Jewish Americans selected to fill the quota. Men chosen because they'd complained about conditions, because they looked weak, or simply because they were standing in the wrong place when the guards needed more bodies. They were loaded into railway cattle cars, 40 men per car. No sanitation, no heat, for a 3-day journey to Berga. Those who survived the transport arrived at a camp that looked nothing like the work detail they'd been promised. Berga was hell with German efficiency. The Americans were immediately put to work excavating tunnels for an underground fuel factory. Workdays lasted 12 hours. The tunnels were blasted with dynamite, filling the air with rock dust that destroyed lungs. Guards beat prisoners who worked too slowly. Food consisted of thin soup, sawdust bread, and occasional rotted vegetables, perhaps 1,000 calories per day, for men performing brutal physical labor in freezing conditions. The contrast with American POW camps was obscene. While Werner Kritzler in Alabama was gaining weight and learning English literature, Morton Goldstein in Berga was watching his body consume itself. While German POWs in Kansas were organizing Christmas concerts, American POWs in Berga were dying of starvation, dysentery, and beatings. Private Acevedo's diary entries from March 1945 make for devastating reading. March 12th. Shapiro died last night. Dysentery. He weighed maybe 90 pounds. We couldn't even bury him properly. The guards made us keep working. March 19th, caught stealing potato peels from the garbage. Guard beat me with a rifle butt. Worth it. March 27, can't remember what my mother's face looks like. Can only think about food. Drew a picture of a hamburger in the dirt today. Simmons cried looking at it April 3rd. Caston fell in the tunnel today. Rock crushed his leg. Guards wouldn't let me treat him. Said to leave him. He screamed for 6 hours before he died. The commandant of Berga was Hauptmann Ludwig Merz, a Nazi party member since 1933 who viewed Americans, especially Jewish Americans, with open contempt. He made clear that the Geneva Convention did not apply at Berga. On March 15, 1945, when an American officer protested the treatment and demanded access to Red Cross inspectors, Merz reportedly replied, "There are no prisoners of war here, only workers. You will work until you are no longer useful." By April 1945, 73 Americans had died at Berga, a mortality rate of nearly 21% in just 2 months. For comparison, the mortality rate for German POWs in all American camps throughout the entire war was 0.15%, less than 1/5 of 1%. An American prisoner at Berga was 140 times more likely to die than a German prisoner in America. The irony deepened when you examined what German POWs were doing in America during these same months. While Americans starved at Berga, German POWs in the United States were not just surviving, they were thriving. They harvested 70% of the sugar beet crop in Minnesota and North Dakota. They picked cotton across Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. 130,000 bales in Texas alone during 1944. They worked in canneries, lumber camps, and food processing plants. They were so valuable to the American agricultural economy that farmers lobbied Congress to keep them in the United States even after the war ended. The relationship between German POWs and American civilians became disturbingly cordial in many communities. In some southern camps, POWs attended local churches. They were invited to town socials. In several documented cases, romances developed between German POWs and American women, relationships that continued after the war, when some POWs returned to marry their American sweethearts. This created grotesque scenes of cognitive dissonance. At Camp Como in Mississippi, on April 7, 1945, the same day 3 American POWs died at Berga from starvation and overwork, German POWs attended an Easter service at a local Baptist church, where the congregation prayed for our boys overseas, while breaking bread with enemy soldiers, who were eating better than many American families. Fritz Haus, a German POW who worked on a farm near Frederick, Oklahoma, later recalled, "The farmer and his wife treated me like a son. I ate at their table. The wife mended my clothes. When the farmer's actual son came home on leave from the Pacific, we shook hands. It was surreal. He told me, 'Well, you got the better deal.' He wasn't wrong." African-American soldiers noticed the grotesque racial dynamics. German POWs traveling through the South to work sites could eat in railroad dining cars that excluded black American soldiers. They could use whites-only facilities that were forbidden to uniformed black servicemen. A German prisoner of war, representing a nation dedicated to theories of racial superiority, had more freedom of movement in parts of America than black Americans in uniform defending their country. This insanity was not lost on observers. Sergeant Lloyd Brown, an African-American soldier, wrote in his memoir about encountering German POWs at a Florida railway station in 1944. The prisoners were herded into the station dining room to eat, while we, American soldiers, defenders of our country, were escorted to the kitchen for our meals. We could not eat where our enemies ate. The double standard became even more apparent when examining repatriation and accountability. When American forces liberated Berga on April 23, 1945, they found 280 survivors of the original 350 American POWs, emaciated, sick, and traumatized. Many weighed less than 100 pounds. Several had permanent disabilities from beatings and malnutrition. Medical officers described conditions as comparable to concentration camps. The liberators immediately began documenting evidence for war crimes prosecutions. Hauptmann Ludwig Merz and several guards were captured. The case seemed clear-cut: deliberate mistreatment of American POWs resulting in 73 deaths, systematic violation of the Geneva Convention, and what appeared to be deliberate selection of Jewish soldiers for special persecution. But then something strange happened. The case stalled. In 1946, Merz and 5 subordinates were tried at Dachau by an American military tribunal. The prosecution seemed vigorous, presenting testimony from survivors like Private Acevedo. But the sentences were shockingly light. Merz received death by hanging, but the sentence was reduced to life imprisonment, then further reduced to 15 years. He was released in 1952, serving just 7 years for the deaths of 73 American soldiers. Other defendants received even lighter sentences, and several were released by 1950. Why the leniency? The answer lies in the emerging Cold War and the desire to rebuild West Germany as an ally against Soviet communism. Vigorous prosecution of German war crimes against American POWs became diplomatically inconvenient. It was easier to quietly forget Berga than to demand justice. Meanwhile, German POWs in America faced virtually no accountability. There were documented cases of murders within American POW camps, hardline Nazis killing German prisoners they considered traitors or defeatists. At least 56 German POWs were murdered by fellow prisoners in American camps. Yet prosecutions were rare. The US government wanted to repatriate German POWs quickly and quietly, not conduct lengthy investigations. By 1946, most German POWs had returned to Germany, many with fond memories of America. Thousands later immigrated to the United States. Some became American citizens. Several wrote memoirs describing their POW experience as unexpectedly pleasant. The best years of the war, as one put it. The Berga survivors received no such warm homecoming. Many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD. They faced indifference from a Veterans Administration, unprepared to acknowledge that American POWs had been subjected to concentration camp conditions. Compensation was minimal. Recognition was non-existent. It took until 1992, 47 years after liberation, for Berga survivors to receive official recognition. By then, fewer than 100 were still alive. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of liberation, a small group gathered at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Private Anthony Acevedo, still carrying his secret diary, finally told his story publicly. The full truth emerged slowly. In 2009, historian Mitchell Bard published Forgotten Victims: The Abandonment of Americans in Hitler's Camps, documenting how American Jewish POWs had been systematically singled out, persecuted and killed, while the U.S. government remained silent to avoid complicating diplomacy with West Germany. The contrast was devastating. The United States spent millions ensuring German POWs were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, even exceeding those standards. Yet, when American POWs were tortured and murdered in violation of every international law, the response was muted prosecutions, reduced sentences, and bureaucratic amnesia. Why did this happen? The explanations are complex and uncomfortable. First, there was genuine American idealism. The United States believed that maintaining high standards for POW treatment would encourage reciprocity. This was naive, but it reflected a deep-seated American faith in the power of moral example. Second, there was economic pragmatism. German POW labor was enormously valuable to American agriculture and industry. Treating POWs well kept them productive and prevented escape attempts and sabotage. Third, there was racial hypocrisy. The same America that fought a war against Nazi racial ideology maintained segregation and discrimination at home. The preferential treatment of white German POWs over black American soldiers revealed the limitations of American moral claims. Fourth, there was Cold War realpolitik. By 1946, Germany was no longer the enemy. The Soviet Union was. Building West Germany into a strong ally required forgetting inconvenient truths about how Germans had treated American prisoners. Finally, there was institutional embarrassment. The American military and government had failed to protect American POWs at Berga and other camps. Acknowledging this failure would raise uncomfortable questions about American intelligence, diplomacy, and military effectiveness. The result was a conspiracy of silence that lasted decades. Today, the stories exist in parallel, but rarely intersect in public memory. There are museums and memorials to POW camps in America, often emphasizing cultural exchange and the surprisingly cordial relations between prisoners and captors. There are far fewer memorials to Berga and other camps where American POWs suffered. The last survivor of Berga, Tony Acevedo, died in 2021 at age 95. Before his death, he donated his diary to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where it remains as testimony to an experience the United States government spent 50 years trying to forget the Berga. Reversal, the grotesque irony of German POWs living comfortably in America, while American POWs died in German slave labor camps, exposes fundamental tensions in how democracies fight wars against totalitarian enemies. How do you maintain moral standards when your enemy abandons them? How do you balance idealism with reciprocity? How do you acknowledge failures without undermining national mythology? These questions remain painfully relevant. In every conflict since World War II, the United States has faced similar dilemmas about POW treatment, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. The Berga reversal offers no easy answers, only the sobering reminder that good intentions and moral superiority do not guarantee good outcomes. On February 13, 1945, Morton Goldstein and Werner Kritzler were both prisoners of war, caught in the machinery of the largest conflict in human history. One would gain weight, learn a new language, and return home with stories of surprising kindness. The other would lose 60 pounds, watch friends die, and carry scars that never fully healed. The only difference between them was which side captured them, and which government gave a damn.